It is the summer of 1862. America is in the throes of the Civil War, and across the pond, three little girls are on a boat with a family friend named Charles Ludwig Dawson, and they are making a trip down the River Thames. Bored as hell, these girls are sitting together very nicely and ask for a story. This gentleman, who's about 30 at the time, kind of starts to make something up off the fly. And so he starts to tell them this really crazy, fantastical tale about a little girl who takes a nap under a tree and ends up in this crazy wonderland. Now, one of the little girls' name is Alice, and that ends up being the name of this main character of a story that the man is making up literally on the fly. Flashback a little bit later. November of that year, he can't stop thinking about this story. And so he puts pen to paper and he starts to write it down. He kind of hyper-focuses because by the beginning of the following year, he has written the entire story, which is actually 2 different novels. He writes it under the name Lewis Carroll. That is the genesis of the story of Alice in Wonderland, which is one of my favorite stories of all time. I love every iteration they've ever made of this. I am not alone. Like, it has captured the imagination of filmmakers and artists and writers and just anybody who's ever heard the story. You'd have to be almost dead inside to not get a kick out of this whimsical, crazy, just drug-induced fever dream of a story. Lewis Carroll ends up getting it published in 1865 with his own illustrations. And it's an absolute sensation. He wants it told exactly the way that it's done. Like, while he was alive, he did not want it to be abridged. He was not interested in the stories being combined. He wanted them to be separate stories. Disney be damned later on. It becomes what he's most known for. Now, scholars have researched Alice in Wonderland for a lot of reasons. First of all, Lewis Carroll is notorious for just littering this story with all sorts of rhymes and riddles and questions, and there's a lot up in the air, even if you just watch the most abridged version, which is like the 1951 Disney adaptation. There's still so much packed into this story that, like, part of you wonders how much of it is him just going insane. Part of it is he just making up this fantastical story for kids? And a lot of it, if you start to really unpack it, especially the books, if you start to really unpack it, you realize that it's actually this crazy extended allegory for historical events. Lewis Carroll was from England, and he was a big fan of Shakespeare. One of the plays that he studied was Richard III. It's Shakespeare's summation of the War of the Roses, which largely inspired a great deal of Alice in Wonderland. Now, whether it was part of the original story that he told these girls on a boat, I don't know. I wasn't there. The real-life Alice, who was living all the way up into the 1900s, never really said anything about whether or not that was part of the story originally, but he did have a lot packed in once the book hit print. And one of the stories that I think gets lost in the War of the Roses, but certainly was incredibly important, was the story of Anne Neville. Anne Neville is a fascinating character in that there's not a lot that you can really find about her, but the life that she led and the position she held during her short life was incredibly important, and I do believe that she's an excellent candidate because she was a pawn at all times of the War of the Roses. And so begins yet another episode of Crowned, Gilded, and Screwed. My name is Kara Mae Adamo, and today we are discussing the one and only Anne Neville. Her life and the way that she was thrown into the thick of things with the Wars of the Roses was in of itself really interesting. Now, there's not a lot said about Anne Neville herself. It's very hard to get to know somebody who was born in the 1400s and died in the 1400s. She wasn't talked about, even though they had a family scholar. He was too busy catching up with everybody else who was causing mischief. Anne herself gets lost between the pages. She's depicted only after death. We aren't really sure what Anne looked like. There are a number of depictions of her, but they're all after death. There are artistic renderings. I think the most contemporary was a sketch from the 1400s, but it's not actually clear whether or not she was alive for that. It could have just been from memory or from somebody's secondhand knowledge of her. There is one stained glass window that still exists that supposedly depicts Anne, in which case she is shown as a blonde, but a lot of women were, and it's a little up for debate on whether or not they actually were blonde. I've seen Anne depicted as a redhead, a brunette, and a blonde. In contemporary literature, we generally speaking look at her as a blonde. It's also pretty likely that she resembled a contemporary of hers named Elizabeth Woodville, who we will get into once I get into the thick of this story, but their resemblance was noted, and Elizabeth was a blonde. So if you're gonna picture Anne, think of her as a very thin, very young, blonde lady in the 1400s. Anne Neville was born into the absolute throes of the Wars of the Roses, which is sometimes called the Wars of the Cousins as well. There are a number of reasons for this, but basically it gets down to the nitty-gritty of what we've already covered before on our Alice of Greece and Denmark episode. Throughout history, royalty has married itself multiple times. There's a lot of inbreeding, a lot of cousins that are marrying, and a lot of cousins as a result of that are at war with each other as well. And the War of the Roses was the pinnacle example of that. Now, the War of the Roses has inspired a number of different stories throughout history. Most recently, of course, is Game of Thrones, but Alice in Wonderland was definitely one of them. And before that, of course, Shakespeare, which by all accounts seems to be where Lewis Carroll got a lot of his information, whether it was accurate or not. Keep in mind that Shakespeare would have been alive in the 1500s, so it wasn't too far after the War of the Roses. So there were a lot of propaganda, slanted interpretations of some of these characters, probably in the Tudors' favor. Although the War of the Roses itself was actually between the Lancasters and the Yorks. So you have these two families, and they are kind of actually the same family, but it's like two branches essentially, and they're marrying into each other. One of them always wants power, is basically like the gist. It's the tale as old as time. So now it's important to understand that Anne Neville is born into a very, very wealthy family. The Nevilles are themselves royal. They can trace their lineage all the way back to the original Edward. And so they do have a lot of claim to nobility. Now, her two parents are very powerful individuals. So you've got the Earl of Warwick, which is her father. And then you have her mother, Anne Buchan. Now, Anne, her mother, Anne, because again, they all name each other after themselves, which, you know, is why we need charts. Anne actually is the one who brought the most titles to their marriage, but because, especially back in the 1400s, which of course is the Middle Ages, women could not assume the titles that their families presented as part of their dowry. It went immediately to their husbands. So at the time you have Edward, the King of England, who Anne's father actually put in charge. He was known as the Kingmaker. That was kind of his nickname. So think of like Game of Thrones, where Jaime Lannister is the King's Slayer. We have the Kingmaker. So the Kingmaker always managed to get himself in the middle of things through propaganda and, frankly, warmongering, always able to sort of like negotiate who was going to be on the throne. Again, Game of Thrones is basically like, with a thin veneer of fantasy, essentially War of the Roses. So if you are familiar with that story, that's the type of world that we're talking about, minus some magic. So Anne's sister Isabel and her are raised in Middleham Castle throughout their childhood. And at the same time that they are raised there, Duke of York, his sons, two of his younger sons, are also raised there at the same time. So you've got two girls, two boys hanging out. They're around the same age. They're raised together as childhood friends. As time goes on, things begin to fracture and come together and fracture and come together. The War of the Roses is a very convoluted thing. So to catch people up on why it's called the War of the Roses, you have the two families, Lancaster and York. Lancaster was often represented by a red rose, whereas York was represented by a white rose. Remember that scene in Alice in Wonderland where the Red Queen is demanding that you have red roses instead of white, and then her little minions are panicking and painting roses red because they accidentally painted white ones. That is symbolic of the War of the Roses, when the Lancastrians and the Yorks are fighting over territory, and at any given moment, one was king and one wasn't. That's essentially what that was, where it's like, we might as well just paint the roses red because guess we're doing this now. Like, that's how fast this stuff changed. It would change in like a year, and then suddenly there was a new king and a new family in charge, and They would always usurp each other. And that's like the crazy, dramatic, terrifying world that Anne is born into. So at some point, while the Yorks are still in power, Anne's father marries Isabel, the oldest daughter, to George, who then becomes Duke of Clarence. So George and Isabel are like the Duke and Duchess of Clarence. They go off on their merry way and they are married. And by married, I mean they're practically not even older than preteens, but they are decidedly married, and that's how that works. Duke of York's oldest son is Edward IV. Now, Edward IV is very close at the time of Anne and Isabel's childhood with their father, because Warwick, again, being the Kingmaker, he's the one who like got him in there in the first place for the most part. So as far as he was concerned, Edward IV like owes him a solid, right? Like, I got you the throne, now you pat my back kind of a thing. And for the most part, I think that like it was a mutually understood thing. And so like the family, on top of being very high nobility themselves, they're also very, very close with the king himself. And again, their two playmates, and now Isabel's husband, are the brothers of the king at this point. Here's the thing about Warwick. Warwick wanted control over everybody's shit. Like, he didn't want to just have like, you know, the king's number. Like, he wanted the king to kind of do what he wanted. Personally, I think that Warwick kind of wanted like a puppet, essentially, or if not a puppet, certainly somebody controllable. And him and Edward IV at most of the time are like this. Like, these are bros. They hang out. And they don't really have any problems until it becomes matchmaking season. So Warwick, being the Kingmaker, had some ideas very clearly in his mind about who would be an excellent queen for Edward. Edward did not agree. Edward did the fantasy thing where he was like, yeah, I hear you, man. I hear all of the good ideas and all of the good strategies that you're coming up with about who's gonna be my spouse, but here's the thing, I'm the king, bro. Like, cute, but no, I'm allowed to marry whoever. I'm in charge. You put me here to be in charge. I'm damn sure gonna be in charge of who I marry. He had a girl in mind, Elizabeth Woodville, that looked a lot like Anne. Remember her? Well, apparently the king had his eyes on her. He wanted this girl bad. And they apparently also already had quite a fondness for each other. So he basically is like, screw you, man. I'm dating and marrying the woman I want to marry. Like, what's the point of being king if I have to be told who I'm gonna marry? He marries for love, which is, first of all, not really done at the time. Like, we view marriage now from this modern perspective, right? Where like you're marrying because you want to be with the person, hopefully. You're marrying because they're, one would hope, a good match for you. There's a vetting process, and it's not, arranged marriages, at least in Western culture, are less of a thing. This is the Middle Ages in England, and it's royalty. Like, arranged marriages are the only thing. In the middle of all of this, Edward decides that he's like, no, I'm not doing that. I'm not going to listen to you. I'm going to marry who I want to marry. So he marries Woodville. And that means that the Woodville family has risen up, because she also was not like high-end royalty at the time. Like, she was probably fine enough for him to have noticed her and certainly gotten to know her, but she's not considered highborn. He essentially marries like almost a commoner, which again is not done, because marriage is a brokerage deal at this point in time, especially when you're commanding one of the biggest and most powerful countries in Europe. This really pisses Warwick off. Like, he's mad because now his homeboy's not listening to him and went and married this other girl that he did not okay. And he's realizing he doesn't have the power over King Edward that he thought he did. So he's pissed at him, but he's also aware of the fact that he just married his oldest daughter to the king's youngest brother. Like, they are now family even more than they were before. So now Warwick is looking around and he's like, I don't feel like I'm where I thought we were in this friendship. I feel a little betrayed. I feel like I don't have say in very much. That sounds to me like you've got a mind of your own, or think you do, and I don't like that. Warwick is almost always scheming. Like, to be a kingmaker, I guess you kind of have to be, but like, the dude was scheming. He was always up to stuff. So what he does is he flips the script and he jets off to France. And he goes and finds the Lancastrians, who, by the way, prior to him putting Edward in charge, the Lancastrians were in charge. So he himself is the reason that the Lancastrian king was ousted. And now he goes and frolics off to find Henry, the king that he ousted. He finds him and he's like, no, I'm sorry, man. Like, I'll get you back in. Let me fix this. So the Lancastrians had been cut out. They'd been dethroned. They were off in France. Warwick shows up, but Henry was actually like captured. Henry's like in the tower. He's captured. He was also just like he was going through some delusions. He was not really known as like a particularly mentally sound ruler, and he was a little bit on the weak side. His wifey is Margaret Anjou, who is like a she-devil. She's so hardcore crazy that not one but two villainesses have been named after her. The Queen of Hearts is named after Anjou, and so is Cersei Lannister. Like, both of them were heavily influenced by her historically. So like, imagine Cersei meets the Queen of Hearts, and like, that's how at least history going forward remembers this woman. And her husband is like this kind of bumbling idiot who then also gets captured, has no control. So she's like acting as king in his stead, you know, like a legit consort. So Margaret is very shrewd, and she doesn't trust Warwick. All this time, Anne is still living her life in Middleham. She is still not a part of this. She's a little kid. She and Richard are having fun in the fields and living their childhoods. Richard is actually there to learn from Warwick's henchmen. Like, he's like there to train as a prince. So they have their own childhood going on. This is all the adults talking. And so Warwick jets off to be in France. And Margaret is like, I don't trust you though, because your homeboy is the king right now, thanks to you. And I don't understand why you're back thinking that we should agree with you. So why would we listen to you? How am I not to assume that you're just gonna find a way to screw us over again? So what Warwick does is he betroths Anne to Margaret's son, a Lancastrian prince, also named Edward. So like, this is gonna get very complicated, but so now he has one daughter who's House of York, and he has another daughter who through marriage is a Lancastrian. That's his doing as like a sign of good faith that they're gonna be cool. Let's go back to the Alice in Wonderland story. Did you know, for those who did not read the book, that Humpty Dumpty is a character in Alice in Wonderland? Fun fact, he is. It is often assumed, or at least suspected, that Humpty Dumpty is actually, like, metaphorically stands for Warwick, where instead of standing on the wall, and it's such a thin wall, and he could teeter back and forth and, you know, don't know which way he's gonna go, that's a metaphor for Warwick on the fence between the two words, like the two houses, between Lancastrian and York, because he's always playing both sides. So Warwick is like supposedly Humpty Dumpty, which I kind of enjoy, because he's just, again, he's like a scheming kind of asshole. So like, I enjoy that he's Humpty Dumpty and eventually falls. Margaret doesn't ever fully trust Warwick. So one of her stipulations about this marriage is that Anne and her son cannot consummate the marriage. She's like, cool, we'll do that maybe, but I want the option to annul this thing. And remember that this is at a time when papal dispensations were required for people to marry anyway because of all the cousin marriages and such. Royalty, generally speaking, cut a check and like just had it handled, but times are a little bit stressed. She wanted the option to annul because she did not trust Warwick. They kind of were like, they were like frenemies through pure necessity. Anne is married to her son, Edward. So she is in France when she gets married. She comes back with everybody else to go take over the throne in England. And literally the only thing that this dude seemed to have done wrong was like married the girl that Warwick didn't want him to marry. And they were all mildly peaceful at this point for a very small period of time. And then that pissed Warwick off. And so now everybody's got to fight again. So here we are. Now his daughters are married on opposite sides of this feud because of him. And Anne is not consummated like in her marriage, but like she's married and, you know, for all intents and purposes, that's her husband. And they go in to have a big ass war to like take over the throne from the House of York. Here's the issue. Not only does Warwick die, but so does her husband. So now Without having consummated the marriage at the tender age of 14, Anne's a widow. She's a widow, and her dad's gone. And her sister is married to the other side. So she's finding herself now on the wrong side. Again, she is 14. Her only thing that she has done wrong is get born into this family so far. She is 14 years old. She has not even consummated her marriage. She was married like 5 seconds ago. Her husband and her dad both die. We aren't entirely sure how her husband dies. It's not clear on if he just dies in battle or if like Richard III, her childhood pal, who again is brother to the king, if he's the one who does it. There's like a really dramatic retelling where he's the one who like does him in. Regardless, we aren't sure who does it. Either way, the dude's gone. 17 years old, he's out. Margaret of Anjou, obviously imprisoned. Henry VI is already dead. And so now nobody has like a firm grip on what to do with Anne, because her parents had a lot of land, and that land normally would be divided up between the two spouses, right? Because they're girls. Their mom is sent to like basically live in like a nunnery. Like she's just sent away somewhere. Nobody really hurts her. She's sent away. I mean, at that point, they're traitors, so kind of a nicer way to handle things, really. Probably because of Isabel and Anne. So she's sent to a nunnery, and then everybody's like, what do we do with Anne, though? Like, she was technically married, but was she really married? It wasn't consummated. Technically, it could be annulled. Was she on this side? Was she on this side? No one knows what to do. But you know who does have an idea? It's George. George, again, is her sister's husband. He grew up with Richard and Anne and Isabel at Middleham Castle when they were kids. George knows just how wealthy this family is, and George wants in. So George is like, hey, let's take care of her. Let's take her in to our beloved home, and let's just make sure she's okay. Let's protect her, right? Let's protect your kid sister because, you know, want to make sure she's all right. It's Anne. I'm going to make sure she's fine. So Isabella's like, all right, yeah, I agree. Let's make sure she's okay. Mom's in a nunnery. We gotta work this out. Yeah, George was as schemy as Warwick. So what George actually does is he really wants to figure out a way to have rights to the entire family fortune. He doesn't want to divide it in half. And as far as he's concerned, Anne's spouse was on the wrong side and is dead and never consummated. So like he wants like a question of the inheritance. So what he does, and this is crazy, this is the reason that I feel she very much needs to be on the list of our episodes here at Crown Gilded and Screwed, because he hides her away. No, listen, he hides her away. Like he disguises her as a kitchen maid, and he hides her in one of Isabel's kitchens in London so that no one can see her, especially his brother Richard, who apparently this whole time has harbored a crush and wants Anne. He was pissed when she got engaged. He's found out that she never consummated the marriage, which I guess mattered. And he wants to marry her. He's like, I originally was thinking we were going to get married when we were kids. Now she's available. Now her dad's out of the way. She's available. Her husband's gone. Why not me? Why can't I marry Anne? Like, I like Anne. I want to spend my life with her. George is like, no, we're not letting that happen. I'm not dividing this up with my brother. I'm going to make sure that you'll never find her. So he disguises her as a kitchen maid and hides her away from the world in the kitchens in London, which is so fucking Cinderella that it makes me crazy that I had never heard this before. So now she goes from being one of the most well-to-do, nobility-born royal people who was married to a prince to like kitchen maid covered in soot, specifically so nobody can recognize her. So Richard goes and finds her, and he rescues her. He breaks her out of the kitchen, and he rescues her like a Prince Charming. But they are 16 and 19. They get married. They do consummate this marriage. George is pissed off. Like, he's so mad. So George goes and whines to his brother, who's the king. The king is like, I don't want to deal with you right now. Like he's just like, you are so whiny. I don't want to deal with this. Yeah, okay, I hear your side. I hear your side. You snuck off and married his ward, sort of, but you also are only doing it because you're greedy. He loves her. What do you, the king had like a decision to make. He also, keep in mind, just had a giant ass battle because these girls' dad used to be his bro, like his buddy, and betrayed him. So he's like a little salty about that. So what he ultimately does is he kind of cuts a bargain between the two brothers. So he feels for his brother Richard because he's like, you love her, I love my girl, so I feel that. You love money, and I see your point. So what ends up happening is Edward's solution is, it's a little unfair, but like I get it for the time and the position he was in at this point, where he was like, listen, broski, you can keep your wife, but you got to give the money to him, because that's really all he wants. If you give the money to him, he'll leave you alone, I will make sure, and you can live with Anne, you can marry Anne, we are wealthy anyway, you are a prince of England, like just renounce her titles, renounce all of her stuff, but you can then move on with your life and you can be with this woman that you love, and he will go live his life the way he wants to live it. And you guys can just not talk about it anymore. So George, of course, only wants the money. So he's like, man, I'm down for that. And then Richard, struggles with it, but he's like, I want Anne. And you're right. We have money, we have power, we have all that stuff. I'm watching you. He's like, you know what? Worth it. I want my girl. Richard III is depicted in a lot of ways throughout history. And, some of them are insanely unsavory. And in a lot of cases, I actually think that that's probably warranted because Richard does pull some shit in his life. He is by no means like a real Prince Charming. Like he's got an edge. He's often playing a couple different angles of himself. He's not as sneaky as George in this particular instance, but he's no better, ethically speaking. He just genuinely does love Anne, and there's something to be said for that. So while I do agree that there are a lot of things that he's accused of that he very much could have done, and there are a lot of motivations probably that he had for a number of things that he did, say what you want about the guy, he renounced her riches so he could stay married to her. So the age-old question, did Richard III love Anne Neville? I think that's pretty evident. Dickheads can fall in love too. In fact, they often do. So that happens. And this is how glaringly obvious that Game of Thrones was ripped straight from the War of the Roses. They become the Duke and Duchess of Gloucester, which are also known as the Duke and Duchess of the North. So they're like literally the Starks. They are White Rose, the Lancasters at this point. They're not, no one's thinking about them right now. And they go and live their lives. And actually at this point in life, Anne and her husband are fairly happy. Like they live a good life. They live a good, happy marriage. It takes a little bit of time, but they actually do end up having a son. So now he's got an heir for all of his fortunes. They name him Edward because apparently they ran out of names. And that's the life that they lead. And they're ultimately very happy with that. In the meantime, we have George. And George and Isabel start to bicker. I don't know what they were fighting about, but I suspect some of it had to do with turning her sister into a kitchen maid, although I didn't know Isabel. Maybe she was all for it. Couldn't tell you, don't have a lot on her personality, just like it's very hard to get really ascertain Anne's personality. 1400s, not a lot written about these women. All we have is them in the context of their times, which pretty par for the course is really only imagined through the workings and dealings of the men that they were around. They could have been funny. We have no idea. They could have been assholes. They could have been all these different things. We have no idea who they were as people. We only know that they were pawns in this never-ending chess match, which again ties us back to Alice in Wonderland with all of the chess and playing card motifs. That is kind of part of that. So Anne is a pawn specifically because she's royal. Nothing she herself has done or could do would save her from this. She's just in it. But her second marriage seems to be a pretty happy one. And her first marriage wasn't terrible either. It was just like, you know, it like just didn't happen. Like it was just a brokered deal that she had no say in. And she didn't even have sex with the guy. So I don't even think it counts. It was just a dude she knew. So George and Isabel start to have some problems. Here's where it gets a little dicey. They start to have problems, and then Isabel dies very suddenly. Almost immediately after she dies, George has one of her maids arrested and executed with basically no trial for poisoning her. But there was no evidence that this happened. He just arrests this poor girl and then like has her executed and like says like, this is the reason why my wife that I'm very much not getting along with right now died very suddenly in the middle of our argument. Again, I wasn't there, but like he also hid her sister away in a kitchen. So for like 2 years. So I think we can kind of get like there are some implications there, I feel. Maybe it was the maid. Feel like the motive like existed somewhere else. So now George and Isabel are obviously no longer married because she is now deceased, and George shortly thereafter actually gets captured and executed himself. He doesn't last very long. Karma can be a bitch. Now we have a problem though. King Edward passes away. He dies. He has 2 sons, and they are the heir apparents, but they're very, very young. And so Richard is turned into the Lord Protector of the boys. Here's where people are a little uncomfortable with Richard. And Anne can be viewed in a couple of ways here. And I want to ask all of you how you feel she fits into this story, with, granted, again, almost no indication of what her personality was like and what her views were like, or even what she really liked. She's got a kid. Kid dies very suddenly. He gets sick and he dies like that. He was always kind of a little sickly anyway. He was never a very strong kid, but he dies. And it's at a time, I feel so bad. Like it's at a time when Richard and Anne were actually like literally en route to go see their kid. Because remember, like back then, these kids would grow up in a castle separated from their parents, and then their parents would do visits and stuff. Like they loved their kids. It's just like, that's how it was done. So they're like literally on their way to go see their kid, and they get word that he has died out of nowhere. They are absolutely fucking devastated, like beyond measure, just screaming devastated. Their only child that they love, and their kid dies when they're about to see him. Like I cannot even imagine the pain that has to create. And keep in mind, like people are dying left and right, but like your kid's your kid. So he passes away, and it's April of like 1484. He dies very suddenly. They were literally on their way to go visit. Anne is so upset that she herself gets like gravely ill. Like it's so bad that she's like dying of heartbreak. When the king dies, he has 2 sons, and remember, like Richard's considered Lord Protector. She like unofficially or even officially, like I'm not actually clear on like the legitimacy of this, but she essentially like adopts like the heir apparent. I think that was more or less to appease her. I don't know how much Richard wanted to adopt the kid. I don't think it also really mattered because this was the heir apparent, and either way, like it looked good for him to be in charge of, you know, the future king. I know that Richard loved his wife. I know he loved his kid. And now he's like sort of adopted his nephew. But again, he's not very close to his brothers. So it's a sketch thing where like we don't know how much adoration he himself might have had for this kid. And the reason that it's up in the air is that a lot happens in a year. So in April, you have their son dying, and you have all of a sudden this other son is like kind of taken under their wing. But then in amongst all of this, Richard, somebody, possibly Richard, throws into question the legitimacy of the 2 boys of his 2 nephews. So now, for their protection, in quotes, very George-like, I might point out, he has them hidden away in the Tower of London, where they are never seen again. They are the infamous princes in the tower. Richard steps in and he becomes Richard III. He becomes the King of England. So does his wife. His wife lasts less than a year, and she passes away of tuberculosis, and he is so grief-stricken that he has to be dragged out of her funeral. Shortly thereafter, people start to suspect that he actually might have had her killed because he wanted to marry his niece. Although there's no proof that that was true. There's no documentation saying that was his intention. And he gets so mad about this that he indignantly and loudly screams at everybody and tells all of them, no, I miss my wife. I'm grieving her. I have no interest in marrying my niece. In fact, I have actually betrothed her to somebody else. So he actually marries her off to someone else and never gets married to her. A little bit later, some of his little scouts go off to try to find other potential spouses of his. But again, he is the King of England at this point. The princes in the tower by now are dead under mysterious circumstances, and he needs an heir. So I think even logistically understand him needing to find another wife, because that's kind of his job, is to have an heir. I don't think that he killed Anne. I don't think that he wanted her to die. I think that she probably was just emotionally distraught and caught tuberculosis at the same time in the 1400s. Anne passes away at 28 years old. Richard follows her almost immediately afterwards. He doesn't even make it another year. So in literally 2 to 3 years, their son, she, and he die. And that is the end of Anne Neville. We never hear from her again. She actually had an unmarked grave until the 1960s, when they finally did put a plaque that is kind of close to where she would have been buried. Richard, of course, being the King of England, he does have a plaque. His grave is marked. Hers is not. That whole thing happened in 14 years. She was married for the first time at 14. She died at 28. Packed a lot in. She went through a lot. She arguably didn't do anything. There is some debate of whether or not she also participated in having the princes thrown into the tower. Some other people have suspected that maybe it was Margaret Anjou. Some people have thought that there were a number of different candidates for this. Either way, Richard certainly didn't stop it from happening. Whether he demanded that they be murdered is up for debate. Child-sized skeletons were eventually found there, and the boys never made it out. There is an urban legend that they made it out alive and lived the rest of their lives, and that just replacement skeletons were put in. There's really no indication that that actually could have happened. Breaking into the Tower of London would have been next to impossible, and that's a story for a completely different time. But the question has always been, was Anne Neville a villain or was she a pawn? And was Richard a villain or a pawn? Because keep in mind, everything that we know about him is after his death, and everything after his death switches back to being into the Tudor Rose era. His death and her death signify the end, roughly, of the Middle Ages. So things change after that. The War of the Roses is basically over, and history proceeded on after them. So I'm going to leave it with the question of, was she a pawn? Was she screwed over specifically because she was born in the wrong place at the wrong time into a difficult family, a royal family, which is basically what we cover on this show? Or was she complicit? Did she participate? It's all conjecture because we don't really have a lot of evidence, because again, even the family historian didn't write very much on Anne, but she is fascinating, and she's come up in a number of different stories throughout the years. She might be very lightly nodded to in Alice in Wonderland as perhaps Alice herself. The reason that I wonder that is that Alice seems to be in the throes of something completely beyond her. There is a point in the book where a little baby is being held by a woman who a lot of people have assumed might be Elizabeth Woodville. And that little baby turns into a pig right before Alice's eyes. And the thing is, Richard, his symbol essentially was a boar. Did Alice/Anne watch Richard become inhumane? That might be a little bit of a heavy-handed symbolic nod, but it could be true. It certainly Carol's style. There's also a question of whether or not Alice in Wonderland is not just Alice's dream, but the king's dream in the story, because the king is largely incapable of ruling his country, and the Red Queen is the one who kind of does everything. Again, Margaret of Anjou. And the question becomes, Tweedledee and Tweedledum pose this nod to Alice, telling her, if he wakes up, you're like a candle in the wind, you're out. And she's like, I couldn't possibly be out. What are you talking about? If I'm a figment of his imagination, are you a figment of his imagination, etc.? That is a nod again to Henry being a little out of it and not really capable of, in any competent way, manning his kingdom and therefore being usurped. And if he would wake up from this crazy dream, maybe he could actually put an end to all of this madness. That's like what Tweedledee and Tweedledum basically say to Alice when she meets them. Without question, the War of the Roses is discussed in Alice in Wonderland. I have always wondered if maybe in some small way, Alice is not just named Alice because of the little girl in the boat from earlier on in our story, but also in some mild manner, potentially Anne Neville herself. So let me know what you think. If you liked this video, I really appreciate a like and a subscribe. You can find us on Facebook and at Crown Gilded and Screwed. And we'll see you next time.